Right, good morning. Today's learning is the memory of Mindel Mariam Bas Kalman Reuven, her Neshama Shem Aliyah, and we are on the bottom of, we're on the bottom of Zion Amud Beis by the two dots, Gufa. Yeah, we got a short Amud today. Some more concepts about different reshuyos and things of that nature. So Gufa, we had a statement earlier on. Amar Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda says as follows: Na'atz kana b'reshus yachid. If a person places a stick in the private domain, a stick or a reed in the private domain, v'zarak, and a person throws an object from the public domain, v'nach al gabav, and beautifully somehow has a great shot and manages to get their item on the top of that stick. Afilu gavoa mea ama, even if the stick is 100 amos high, chayav, the person is going to be chayav in pnei shus hayachid ola ad rakia, because of the fact that reshus hayachid goes up to the heavens. So what's the novelty of the statement? The novelty is not that reshus hayachid goes up to the heavens that we saw before. The novelty is Rav Chisda telling us, very good. It's not the right dimensions. We had a whole discussion earlier about the fact that you need it to be dalet al dalet. You need it to be 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim. Or the exception we saw from Rava was that if it goes into a hand is also considered like a proper catching. But a stick, Rav Chisda is basically teaching us that a stick, and specifically in Reshus HaYachid, that you don't need, Rav Chisda's chiddush, the novelty of Rav Chisda is that you don't need a 4 by 4 dimension. So Rav Chisda is arguing on that entire Gemara before. It's interesting that the Gemara introduces this notion over here, but the idea is, Rav Chisda says, in the private domain, a person does not need 4 by 4. Why would there be a distinction between the private domain and the public domain? It seems very strange. So Tosfos says, Efsher. He says, he throws this as a possibility. He says, perhaps Shema Yesh Lomar. And this on Daf Ches, he says that possibly you could say that we had a concept that we saw earlier, and when regarding a house, we said that a house is kimalya, that a house is like it's filled up. We had this notion that when you have something that's encompassed, that's something which has walls and could have a ceiling as well, but it has walls, it's like it's filled up. And so perhaps Rav Chisda holds that since a private domain is always fenced in, perhaps he perceives a private domain as if it's full. In other words, it's filled with, there's nothing there obviously, but it's filled, just like you have the walls around, the walls kind of create a place, and that place is full, and therefore anywhere that it falls in the private domain, it's going to be considered like it fell onto a place, and therefore the private domain would be an exception, whereas in the public domain you do need 4 by 4. In the private domain, even if it's less than 4 by 4, it would still be considered falling on a specific place. Okay? It's that's the opinion of Rav Chisda, and that's the opinion of the Gemara over here. So the Gemara says,
Gufa usually is bringing a statement from the previous thing, right?
Correct.
So where was this?
Did we have, that is a good point. Did we have Rav Chisda earlier on?
Must be going back some ways.
Well, we had earlier on a stick of, with them. We had the kana, but we had the kana with a, It was on Zayin Amud Aleph, the last 2 lines. Remember, okay, thank you for keeping us on task. Okay, says the Gemara on the bottom of Zayin Amud Beis. Lema Rav Chisda Damar Rebbe. So this now we say maybe Rav Chisda goes like Rebbe. We saw this Rebbe earlier in our previous discussion. Netanya. Rebbe says, we have a brayso. Zarak v'nach al gabe ziv kol shehu. If a person throws something from the public domain and it falls onto a little protrusion, Rebbe says you're chayiv. Rebbe mechayiv v'cham potrim. The Chachamim say you are pater. Alma lo be'inan makom dalet al dalet. Clearly, you don't need a place of 4 by 4, right? Meaning Rebbe's opinion. There's a view over here which says that you don't need it to land on a place of 4 by 4. Amar Abai, we're on top of Ches Amud Aleph. I did skip ahead to see the turning of the daf from Rabbi Stefanski, just to see him say the shout outs to Ner Tamid about whatever. It's very beautiful. Just the daf being sponsored for the official and Simcha for the thousands upon thousands of minutes that were learned. Anyway, check it out. Amar Abaye. So turning of the daf, which is not sponsored. Okay, Amar Abaye says Abaye. V'shus yachid in the private domain to kuli amalo pligi kirav Chisda. So Abaye says now that again this is radical, because earlier we thought everyone agrees you do need something to land on a full-fledged place of 4 by 4, but now Abaye, we're on Ches Amud Aleph at the top. Abaye is saying in the private domain, everyone agrees, like Rav Chisda, that you do not need a place of 4 by 4. Right? The Gemara seemingly is concluding over here, whereas until now we assumed everyone agrees you do need a place 4 by 4. We're saying no, in the private domain, you don't need a place of 4 by 4. It falls even on a small thing, it's fine. Elahacha, but here we're not talking about that case. Rebbe and the Rabbanan in that Bryce are not talking about that case. Rather, Be'ilana Omed B'Reshus Yachid, V'nofo Notel Reshus Rabim. We're talking about a case where the tree is standing in the private domain, its branches are extending into into the public domain. Vizarak, and a person throws from the public domain. V'nach anofo, and it falls on a branch, which is also in the public domain, but again, the tree itself is in the private domain. The Rebbe Savar Amrinan Shdei Shadi Nofo Basar Ikaro. Rebbe holds that you look at the branch and you associate it with its ikar, with the I came up blanking this word. The trunk. Thank you. My gosh, the trunk of the tree, and therefore you say that since the branch, even though the branch is in the public domain, it's attached to the trunk, which is in the private domain, and therefore we see as if you threw from a public domain into the private domain. For Rabbanan Savri, Lo Amrinan Shtei Nofo Basar Ikaro, and the Rabbanan say no. You look at the domain as if where it is. The branch is in the public domain, so you threw from public domain to public domain. It landed on a little nothing, and a little nothing outside the private domain. Everyone would agree you are not going to be chayav for. Okay, so the bottom line is the Gemara over here is concluding that although we had a previous discussion saying that you need an item to fall on a place of 4x4, it has to fall on something solid. It has to go from somewhere like that's supported to somewhere that's supported. But when it comes to the private domain, everyone agrees that there you don't need it to fall on a sturdy place. It could even fall on a small place, and you would still be chayav. Okay, fine. That's the bottom line. That's the conclusion of the Gemara. Let's go further. Okay, so it says the Gemara at the 2 dots. Ches Amud Aleph. Amar Abaye says like this: Zarak kaveres l'rshus harabim. If a person is standing in the private domain and they throw a basket, okay, into the public domain, and we're talking about a large basket, Givoa asara. It's a basket that is 10 tvachim high. Ve'ein rechava vav. But it is not 6 tefachim wide. Okay, so imagine a large basket. It's about yay high, and it's about, it's a wide basket. It fills a lot of things. It's not 6 wide. Okay, so chayav, you're going to be chayav. Okay, why? Because why not? You'd be chayav. You're throwing an object, right? However, rechava vav, if it's 6 tefachim wide, pater, you're going to be exempt. Why are you exempt if you throw a basket which is 10 tefachim high and 6 tefachim wide? Any thoughts? Okay, the Gemara, the Mefarshim explained that the idea is that if it's that large, it's no longer considered an object, meaning, of course, it is an object, but it's exactly, it's a reshus to its own. In other words, let's go back. Where do we find the source for all of the malachos? Where do we find? What's the source to tell us that this is an action that is forbidden? What's the source of all that? The Mishkan, right? Basically, when whatever took place in the building of the Mishkan, that is seen as malacha, that is seen as work, and those things are forbidden. Let's just pause now, just to take a moment, just to appreciate that. The idea is the idea of what is forbidden on Shabbos is that on Shabbos we cannot do creative work. The Mefarshim points out, actually later commentators, Nechama Leibowitz and others point out that if you look at the terminology in the building of the Mishkan, it's actually quite parallel to the terminology in the creation of the world. Right? The Mefarshim explain that when God created the world, and then what's taking place in the Mishkan is that God is asking humankind, I want you to build something. And it's almost like we are the creators now. Until now, God has been in charge, but now when we are building the Mishkan, God is saying, you human beings, you're in charge now. You are going to be the creators of the world, right? This is right after the giving of the Torah. God is basically saying, you can't just be a passive passenger in the world. You are creators. Whatever you do, you are the ones who are building. You're the ones who are in charge. You're the ones who need to build the world. You can't just say, well, God will provide. God is going to take care of it. You are the ones who are building, and that's why the terminology of the Mishkan is parallel to that of the creation of the world. But the point is that we find creative work, we find like actions that create something in the building of the Mishkan, and any of those actions are now going to be deemed as something which you cannot do on Shabbos. Why? Because on Shabbos we're saying, God, yes, we create 6 days a week, we work, we hustle, but on Shabbos, God, you're in control. Right? So it's only things that were done in the Mishkan, those we don't do on Shabbos, okay? So if it's in the Mishkan, they were passing utensils, items, smaller items, yes, some of the, beams, but the point is, there was nothing that was tremendous, right? And basically, once it's 6 tvachim wide and 10 tvachim high, we treat it as, you're not passing an item, like Max said, it's almost like you're passing a domain. It's like a domain is moving, meaning at some point, it's so large, it's like you're moving like a booth. Right? If you're moving a booth, that's not an item. That's like a booth is like an enclosed area. It's like, excuse me, because it's the only example that comes to mind. But like, imagine moving a porta potty. Moving a porta potty from a private domain to public domain. That's not an item. That's a place. It's like a walled-in thing, right? So this basket over here is basically like you're not moving an item. You're moving a place from place to place. You're not chayiv, right? And therefore, once it's 6 tvachim wide and 10 tvachim high, you are going to be pater. Rava says, yes, but. He says, afilu ein rechava vav, pater. He says, even if it's not exactly 6 wide, you're going to be exempt. My time. What's the reason? So he says, because it's impossible that the edges of the reeds will not go above 10 tvachim. What is he talking about? We're talking about a basket. How are baskets made? They're made with reeds. Now, nowadays, everything is made, I don't know, machine made or whatever it is. You're going to have you're going to have a basket and the edges are going to be smooth, etc., etc. But back in the day, everything's handmade. So if I tell you I have a 10 tefach basket, right? It's 10 tefachim high. It's by definition there's going to be stuff sticking out, right? Things are not so clean, and therefore it's above 10 tefachim. And once it's above 10 tefachim, why is that significant? Rav is saying if you have something which you tell me the basket is 10 tefachim high, there's going to be little things protruding above that. Why? And therefore he says, by definition, even if it's not 6 tvachim wide, even if it's not an equivalent of a porta potty, it's an object, still you're going to be pater. Why are you pater? Because if it's above 10 tvachim high, what did we say about Rishus HaRabim? Where does Rishus HaRabim end? Where does the public domain end? 10 tvachim. Okay, by the way, I know this sounds like so arcane, whatever, but this principle of being above 10 tvachim is going to be very, theoretically relevant. We'll come to some practical examples. A person remembers they're carrying items in Rishus HaRabim, right? There's going to be a major difference between holding an item in your hands and holding an item like this, which is above 10 tvachim, right? Again, you can't walk into the public domain doing that, but it certainly takes it from something which is certainly doraisa into a different category if it's above 10 tvachim. So this principle above 10 tvachim is going to have some practical ramifications. Not that we're talking about them today, but just it's a principle that we'll keep in mind. Okay, so basically, Rav is coming along and saying, since a basket by definition is above 10 tvachim, in order to be chayiv, you need to have something fully in the public domain. If you have something which is protruding above the public domain into the 10 tefach above area, you're not going to be chayiv. You're going to be pater, since it's not fully in the public domain. It's partially in the private domain. It's partially in the domain where you are exempt. Yeah, make sense? Okay. Says the Gemara, new principle. Okay, here's a principle that plays a role for different walls. Let's talk about this for your sukkah for a second, and then we'll apply this there. So you have you have a sukkah. You build a sukkah. You want your sukkah. I don't know. Someone just recently showed me their sukkah. They wanted to. I'm trying to remember what it was. It was made of like this cool design around the walls, but the problem was the walls did not reach the ground. Okay, so it was like a netting, not a netting. It was like a whatever it was like some nice design that basically that went around their sukkah, but the walls did not reach the ground. Okay, they're a few tefachim high. They're 2 tefachim high. So we know we need the wall for a sukkah to be valid, it needs to be 10 tefachim high, and it's supposed to be reaching the ground from the ground up. Okay. However, this sukkah was the ground itself. It didn't reach the ground fully. Okay. Is it a good sukkah or not? It was about 2.5 tefachim high. Okay. Yes. Why?
Because if it's under 3 tvachim, it's part of the ground.
If it's under 3 tvachim, so it is under the ground. So yes, and over here specifically when it comes to walls, we have this principle. It's a halacha l'Moshe miSinai. We have a tradition all the way to Moshe. It's not written down in the Torah, but that is something called lavud. Lavud tells us that if a wall of a partition is within 3 tvachim of the ground, then it's like we imagine the wall to continue down and reach the ground. Okay, we can understand conceptually, like you see something, it looks like it's almost to the ground, but the point is halachically, a person builds their wall of their sukkah, and it doesn't go all the way to the ground. It's a few inches up. It's not all the way to the ground. It's as if it goes to the ground because of lavud, because of this principle of lavud, saying that it's as if it goes to the ground. So that principle of as if it is as if it goes to the ground, lavud, is going to be applied over here to the laws of Shabbos as well, as we will see. Okay, so says the Gemara, kafa'a al piha. Let's say a person takes that basket and flips it over. Okay, and they flip it over. So now they're no longer throwing the basket from the private domain to the public domain, right side up, but rather they turn it upside down. So the basket's upside down. So think about it. It's like the basket kind of has like walls around it, right? A basket is made up of walls, and now you're throwing it into the public domain. So we'll see that the principle of lavud will be discussed over here. So kafa al pia, a person turns the basket upside down. Shiva umashu chayav. If it's 7 tefachim and like a tiny bit, you're still going to be chayav. Okay. Shiva umechetza. However, if it is 7.5 pater, you are going to be exempt. Why are you exempt? This opinion is saying you're going to be exempt because let's say I have something which is 7.5 tefachim. So again, if I have an object that is partially in the public domain, right, then I'm going to be, I take something, like we started a minute ago. If I take an object which is 10.5 tefachim high, right, and I put it into the public domain, am I chayiv or pater? I'm pater. Because once it's above that 10 tefach range, then it's out of the Rishus Harabim. I didn't fully put it into the Rishus Harabim because it's still protruding outside the Rishus Harabim. So now we're saying, but let's say, okay, it's not 10.5 tefachim high, but it's 7.5 tefachim high. I throw it into the public domain. Now, when it starts to land, okay, so it starts to land, when it reaches the moment where it's within 3 tefachim of the ground, it's as if it's already on the ground, right? Because we have the principle called lavud. Just like my sukkah walls, right? When it's within 3 tefachim, it's already seen as part of the ground, right? So there's a wall there. Even though there's no real wall, there's a halachic wall. And it's as if it's already on the ground. That's why my wall of my sukkah, even if it's almost 3 tefachim high, it's still considered attached. Similarly, imagine I have this basket. The basket has walls. I throw it. It's 7.5 tefachim high. So as it's coming down, slow motion, okay? It hits the 7.5 tefach, right? Now it's 2.5 tefachim from the ground, let's say, right? Now it's as if it's already on the ground. Right? And if it is as if it's already on the ground, and because it's attached, then it's already protruding above the 10 tefach height, and therefore when it entered into this airspace, it's something which is not fully, it didn't fully go into Rishus Harabim, it was protruding outside of Rishus Harabim, and therefore you're going to be pater, using that principle of lavud over here to make an exception because of the fact that it's above 10 tefachim. Okay? Because when it's landing, it basically came in as part of outside of the Rishus Harabim, and therefore you're pater, and that's the first opinion. However, Rav Ashi disagrees, says, afilu shiva mechza chayav. He says, no, even if it's 7.5, you're going to be chayav, even if it's upside down. My taima, mechitzan mechitzos lesochan asuyos. He says the walls of the baskets are made to be right side up. In other words, he says, yes, for partitions, for your sukkah, yeah, that works because it's meant to be a partition. But your baskets are made to be right side up, not upside down. He says the principle, he suggests that the whole principle of these walls being halachically extended is only if it's really made for partition, etc. But over here, when you have a basket which is made to be right side up and you turn it over, we don't extend that because the basket is not meant to be focused that way. The basket is meant to be right side up, and therefore the whole principle of lavud would not apply in such a case. Okay? Fine. Let's go a little further.
Why are we going to 7? What is magic about 7?
Because 7 brings us to a place because we need to get to a little bit over 10.
But it's not 10.
No, but 7.5 is.
How is 7.5 10?
Because 7.5 within 3, 7.5 within 3 plus 3 is 10.5.
Oh, so we're saying that it only has to be that because it connects.
Correct. Once it's 7.5, then it's already 10.
Sorry about that.
No problem. Amar Ula. Okay, so now the last principle we'll be discussing today is we saw in earlier Gemara that when something is above 3 tefachim in Rishus Harabim, okay, you're in the public domain, you're walking around, and there is an area which is above 3 tefachim high, right? Is that considered part of the Rishus Harabim or not? Above 3 tefachim. No. Right? Because above 3 tefachim, we saw that it's like people don't walk there. Right? Imagine you had a protrusion, which is not like close to the ground. It's like, okay, imagine this is the ground. It's like about over here. Right? It's like in your way. Right? You walk around this. Right? It's not part of Rishus Harabim. We saw a bunch of cases where let's say a person standing in Rishus Harabim, and they were to, that stand over here, this brick, let's say, that's above 3 tefachim high, it would be considered not part of Rishus Harabim, because it's in your way. It's not something that's like, we'll call it a Carmelis, but it's not full-fledged Rishus Harabim because people don't walk there. It's something you avoid, right? Under 3 tefachim, we said, people walk on that. That's fine, okay? The Gemara is going to elaborate a little bit more on things in Rishus Harabim. Amar Ula, Amud Tisha. Let's say you have a pillar that's 9 tefachim high, okay? Rishus Harabim in the public domain. Now, if it's 10 tefachim high in the public domain, is it part of the public domain? Absolutely not. But if it's 9 tefachim or lower, v'rabim mechatzvin alav, and many people adjust their items on it. Okay, so let's give an example, a great example that people over here will appreciate. You have, 10 tefachim is not so high, right? 10 tefachim is not so high. So 10 tefachim for many people is like a comfortable place to place things. So for example, if you were a woman sitting in our women's section, right by the mechitza, you would know that many men place their sitter over there, right? You might want to punch them, but that many people do that, right? Why? Because it's a comfortable height, right? So 9 tefachim, 10 tefachim, that's a pretty comfortable height. So in the public domain, 9 tefachim, what's going to happen is people are walking through the public domain, they're carrying their load, and there's a 9 tefach height thing, which is basically a little bit lower than mechitza. So people are going to, they're tired, they put down their basket for a second, they put down their load for a second, and then they pick it up again. But the point is that 9 tefach place is part of the usage of the public domain. Right? In other words, until now we're talking about things very close to the ground, which we'll get back to in a moment. There, it's very close to the ground, it's inconvenient. But 9 tefachim, that's person height. That's where you put your sitter. That's where you put your load, right? So again, just like people put something on the mechitza, which is 10 tefach, 9 tefach is just a little bit lower. That's like a convenient height. People place things on it. If people are placing things on it, then it now assumes the identity of the Rishus Harabim. That's why he says if you place something, since many people place things on it, v'zark v'nachal gabav, chayav. If a person therefore throws something, let's say from the private domain onto that protrusion of 9 tvachim, you're chayav, because that's now considered part of the public domain. Since people use it, it's part of the public domain. Granted, you can't walk on it, but it's a place where people comfortably place things on when they're in the public domain. My time, and why is that? And now we'll break it down. Pachos mishlosha, if it's less than 3 tvachim from the ground, very low, midras darsi le rabim, then people step on it, and therefore it's part of the public domain. Mishlosha vad tisha, but from 3 to 9, low midras darsi le, it's too low, it's too high, so people can't walk on it. It's like annoying, it's in the way. However, but people don't place things on it because it's too low. If it's something like over here, I'm not going to lean down. It's only when it's a convenient height. Tishav, if it's 9 tvachim, vadai mechatvin iluya, people place things on it, and therefore you are going to be chayav. Okay, so that's the Gemara concludes that a 9 tefach high, stand in the public domain. Since it's a convenient place for people to place things as they're walking the public domain, it's part of the public domain, full-fledged public domain. Amalei Abayla Rav Yosef Guma Mai. Abaya asks Rav Yosef. He says, "What about a pit? A pit in the public domain that's 9 tvachim deep. Again, if it's 10 tvachim deep, everyone agrees it's not part of the public domain. What about 9 tvachim deep? Now again, keep in mind, back in the day, it's a different world. People would, just like you spoke yesterday about people placing items in crevices on the side of the wall, similarly, people would place things in the ground. Okay, they're walking the public domain. I know it sounds bizarre to us, but that's what people do. Oh, I have my item. I need to go run into this house. There's a hole. I'm going to take advantage of it. And people place things on the ground, in the hole. Okay, so the question is, if it's 9 tvachim deep, is that considered part of the public domain? So Amar Lei v'chein beguma. He says, yeah, the same thing would be true. 9 tvachim deep, it would be considered part of the public domain. Rava Amar beguma lo. Rava disagrees and says, no, a pit, no. My time tashmish aidei adchak lo shmei tashmish. He says it's true that people do place things in holes in the ground, but at the end of the day, you have to bend down, you have to put it in. That's already a little inconvenient. It's something which is not so simple, and therefore, if it's a little bit, which wouldn't be, if it's super comfortable to do in the public domain, then it's part of the public domain. But if I have to bend down to put it in this basket, it's not considered part. In the ground, in the hole. It's not convenient, it's not simple, and therefore it's not part of the public domain. Okay, now we're going to ask a question on Rava. Esvei Rav Ada Bar Masna LeRava. Rav Ada Bar Masna asks Rava, Haisa kupasa munachas b'rishus harabim gevoa asar. Let's say a person has a basket in the public domain, which is 10 tvachim high, v'rachava daled, and 4 tvachim wide. Ein mitaltlin. A person has their basket placed in the public domain. It's 10 tvachim high, 4 tvachim wide. Ein mitaltlin mitocha l'rishus harabim, v'lo m'rishus harabim l'tocha. If it's 10 tvachim wide, 10 tvachim high and 4 tvachim wide, what is that? It's Rishus HaYachid. It's a full-fledged, if you have a basket, a huge basket, not huge, a big basket, it's this big, it's this high, okay, that is a private domain. So you can't place things in the basket from the public domain, because you're going from that's like going from a public domain into the private domain. You can't take things out of the basket into the public domain, because that's going from a private domain into a public domain, okay? V'lo Rishus Harabim, Pachos mikan, if it's, right? You can't go either way. However, less than that, meaning if it is less than 9 tvachim, mitaltlin, then you are allowed because it's all part of the public domain. And then the Brisa concludes by saying, v'chein beguma, and the same principle applies to a guma, to a hole. So that implies that the same principle, that yes, 10 tvachim is a private domain, but if it was 9 tvachim, it would be part of the public domain. That's what it sounds. V'chein beguma sounds like everything we just said in the first clause is going to be true by the whole as well. And 10 tvachim, private domain, 9 tvachim, public domain. So the Gemara says, my lava seifa is the v'chein beguma going on all those same principles. So the Gemara says, lo aresha, it's only going on the first clause. Again, the Brisa started off by telling us the clause 10 by 4, it's a private domain. All right, and then it said if it's less, it's now part of the public domain. And so then it said, and also by a hole. Now, when we said also by a hole, are you saying also on everything that was said above? In which case, a hole that is 9 tvachim deep is part of the public domain? That's what we assumed, and therefore it's a question of Rava's position, because it sounds like 9 tvachim deep, 9 tefach deep hole is considered part of the public domain. The Gemara says no, v'chein beguma is only going on the first clause, which is to say that if it's 4 tvachim wide and 10 tvachim deep, then it's part of the public, then it's part of the, sorry, if it's 10 Tvachim and 4, then it's a private domain. But if it's less than that, the Gemara is not really, the Bryce was not really dealing with. Again, when you say, and also, you say, is it also on everything, or is it also only on the first clause? You're saying only on the first clause, and therefore we don't have any conclusive question of Rava. We're going to continue this discussion about Rava, and bear with me. We are almost at Daf Yud, and that's where it kind of changes gears, and a little bit less about the domains. I know the domains is a little bit hard for us to wrap our heads around, but at the very least, as I think I said the first day, just simply to remind ourselves that there is, this is not relevant to us because we have an Eruv. We are incredibly blessed. But there is this notion that people forget that there's an Eruv. People don't even know there's an Eruv. I get the story the first day. We're traveling and in a place, in a home, and there's no Eruv over there, and people are walking, and we have one of the kids we were staying, basically walks outside with a sitter. They're we're going to go daven outside, so beautiful. Like, there's no Eruv. There's no Eruv. Like, what do you mean there's no Eruv? They don't even know what that is, right? We're so accustomed to it. So at the very least, if I want to take something practical to this Gemara, is like, we live in a blessed world where we have this incredible ability to have an Eruv, but at the very least, these Gemara should simply, if it's a little bit above us and a little bit hard to, so many details which are not relevant, just a simple reminder that if sometimes you are in a place which doesn't have an Eruv, to remind ourselves there's a concept called transferring, private domain, public domain, and all these things would be incredibly relevant because they didn't have Eruvs. It wasn't typical to have Eruvs, and therefore to recognize that these halachos apply, we don't think about them often, but they exist. We're just blessed to have the Eruv, but we shouldn't take it for granted. Okay, have a great day.